Hey team, welcome to the party. Today we are talking authentication in NextJs using the NextAuth package. I'm going to show you the strategies, patterns, and providers you need to use to correctly implement authentication in your NextJs app. I have condensed everything that I learned implementing NextAuth in a note on my site, and I'm going to include a link in the description below for you to follow along. And in this video, I'm just going to walk over that same note and step by step trying to kind of build on our system. So let's go. I have just created a standard Next.js application, as you can see here. And all I did so far is to create this index.js file, which is this homepage that you can see. I've included some buttons and links for us to be able to sign in and sign out. I'm showing the status of the current user being authenticated or not. Let me just turn this off. And also I'm showing any active session if there is any, or if the user isn't logged in and there is no session, it doesn't show any session over here. Don't worry about this. When time comes, I'm going to explain how I did each and every of these hooks and functions that I'm using in this. I just had to prepare this in advance so we have something to work with. So let's get started. How do we start implementing NextAuth? Well, glad you asked. Let's install the package first. So npm I next-auth to install the package. Once it is installed, we can restart our development server. And the first thing we need to do is to initialize the NextAuth package. And the way that you do it is you would create a catch-all route in your API folder. And what this does is this is going to take in your options and your configurations, and it's going to produce your request handlers or your API handlers, so that any authentication related request later on to your backend will be responded from the handlers that's automatically generated from this file. So let's just go ahead and do that. In our pages, in our API folder, I'm going to create another folder called auth. Inside of it, I'm going to create this catch-all route called next-auth. Inside of it, let's import next-auth function from the package and export this as default by calling this function. And this is where you would pass your options. The first option you would want to pass is your providers. What are providers? Well, providers are services that your users can use to log into your system. At a high level, 3 different categories. First, OAuth providers, like Google sign-in, Facebook sign-in, LinkedIn, Twitter, you name it. The second category is email provider. The email provider is a kind of magic link, passwordless solution whereby you would send a link, email a link to the user, they would then click on it to get signed in. They don't have to create a password, and you as the developer don't have to manage their password, so it's easier and safer. And the third category is credentials provider. A credentials provider is for when you have an existing authentication system. Imagine you have already users with their emails and usernames and passwords, and you want to integrate that existing system into your Next.js app with NextAuth. That's where you would use the the credentials provider. Now we're going to explain examples of each one of these categories, and in fact, let's start with the OAuth provider. We're going to start by implementing Google sign-in. It would be the same for other providers in the OAuth category, but we will just show the Google. So if you go to NextAuth documentation, you would see a segment for all the providers that they support. There's a humongous list of all the providers you can use. If you click on Google, it tells you that you have to first register an application or a login service on Google Cloud Services. And there's a link there you could follow. It takes you to Google Cloud Services, API and services. You would create a new project. That's the OAuth project that you want to create. And the first thing you would want to do is once you create create project for the first time, you have to set up your OAuth consent screen. That's the screen that the user will see when they want to give consent for your app to use the Google OAuth service or their account for the authentication. Now it would ask for your email, and pretty easy. You just set this up. You come back to credentials, and you would click the create credentials. You would select OAuth client ID, and once you do this, it's going to ask you for your application name. It's going to ask you if it's a web application or a mobile application, and it's going to ask you for a redirect URL. And that redirect URL is the URL that the users are going to be redirected after they completed the sign-in on Google. Where you would get that URL is that it will come in this format. So whatever your origin is, example.com, mydomain.com. Let me just turn this off over here too, so this won't pop on us. So whatever your origin is, whatever your domain, your website is, and then /API, auth, callback, and the provider ID. In this case, for Google, it will be, for example, example.com, API, auth, callback, and Google. So this would be the redirect URL that you would set when you're registering your application in Google Cloud Services. It's the same way for Facebook too. So you create a login service or a Facebook login, you create an account, you would create, pass your redirect URL, and then you would get back a client ID and a client secret. So out of this process on Google, you would need to get back your client ID and client secret, bring it all the way back, and set it as your environment variables in your Next.js application. The way that you set environment variables in Next.js is that you'll create a .env.local. Let me show you right here. .env.local file in your project's root directory. And then you would set key value pairs as your environment variable. So we would need to set Google Client ID and client secret. So I have created this example that I can show you here, Google Client ID, client secret. There are other stuff that we need. I'm going to explain what these other options are. MongoDB URI is for my database, and the rest is for the NextAuth package to work correctly. So you won't do it in the example. I just put this here so that I don't have to open my local and expose my information, but you would do it in the .env.local. Once you set those client ID and client secret up, you have to just get the Google provider from the package. So I'm going to import this over here, and I'm going to just call this function. Providers, by the way, this option that we're passing to NextAuth is an array, so you can provide as many providers as you want. So I'm just going to call Google provider, and to it I'm going to pass options. My options are going to be, as you can see, the client ID and client secret. Let me just grab them from here. And this client ID and client secret, we're reading from our environment variables. Okay. Now with this set up, the last step is, once you set this up, if you go to this endpoint, API auth sign in, you will see your sign-in page. So let's go to that page, and that's why I have these buttons over here. So if I click on the sign in, you see I'm going to API auth sign in, and this is showing a sign-in page. This page I haven't created. This comes with the NextAuth package built in, and it is automatically generated based on the providers that you pass into your NextAuth. So as we are building up on this providers list, you would see all the options appear here automatically. Now, if you want to customize this page, you can, and we're going to get to it in the following steps and the following options that you can pass. But to begin to just get up and running, you can use the built-in sign-in page. Now, let's see what happens if I click sign in with Google. Well, it takes me to Google sign-in flow, and I'm signed in. And as you can see here, the status changed to authenticated, and I'm seeing the session object. We're going to talk about the session object later on, but as you can see, there's a user property on it with some information about the user, name, email, image, and an expiry on the session. So we're now signed in, as easy as you just witnessed. Okay. Next step, let's use the email provider. Now, the email provider, as I said, is a passwordless login whereby you would email a link to the user. They would click on it and get signed in. They don't need a password. You don't need to manage a password. But there's a catch. You need a database. And the reason why you need a database is that in the link that you're sending to the client, you would include the verification token so you can connect that user with the account that was registered on your site. To persist that verification token until the user clicks on that link, you need a database. How do you define a database in NextAuth? I'm glad you asked. You would do that through an adapter. So I'm going to jump ahead from this setup for a second to set up an adapter, and we'll come back to the rest of the setup. How do we do this? Well, an adapter, if you go on the site, and let me just close this off, there is a section for adapters, and NextAuth already has defined some adapters that works with databases like Prisma, Fauna, DynamoDB, MongoDB is the one that I'm using. And if it is not listed here, you can create your custom adapter for the database that you would want to use. There is again a link here that shows what functionality and features you need to provide to be able to connect to the database to read and write to your specific database. To set it up, you would need to install packages. So let me just go follow the link that I want from MongoDB, for example. Now, these adapters in prior versions of NextAuth were part of the NextAuth package, but in the version 4, they have abstracted these adapters and complementary packages out of the core. So you have to install them separately. So I've installed MongoDB and I've installed this package. So all I need to do now is to bring in this MongoDB adapter that I've installed into my file. I'm going to do that. And then for MongoDB connection to work, for this adapter to work, you need to pass a connection, a connected client. For that, I created this lib folder. Inside of it is a MongoDB. You could see the steps over here too. That's how you would create a Mongo client and connect to your database and pass that connected client to your application, or just share it around, export it so that you can use it in different parts of your application. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. I have a URI that I got from MongoDB. That's my connection string that has my credentials and the address on which my database is living. And I'm just connecting to that database by creating a new Mongo client. And then I'm sharing this client promise throughout my application so I can use it in anywhere that I want it. So I'm going to also bring in this client promise that I have created in my lib folder, and the rest is just bringing in the email provider. So let's just go back to our steps over here. I'm just going to close this guy. So I'm going to show you how we would use this adapter in a second. Let me just close this off real quick and bring in the adapter option. I'm going to close the provider. So adapter is going to be a separate option that we're going to pass to NextAuth. So I'm specifying an adapter. I am calling this function that I got from the MongoDB adapter from the NextAuth package, and I'm passing it the client promise. This is a connection to my own database to this. And that's how you would define an adapter for NextAuth to use. I'm using a connection to the database. You can use that connection elsewhere in your application if it needs a database, or if it's just for the purposes of authentication. That's how you would instruct NextAuth to use that adapter and that connection. Coming back to the rest of the email provider setup, let's just follow along. Okay. Okay, now that we know using email provider required us to have a database, we have set up our database, we have included an adapter, a connection, we could just move on. Now, we need to have a way for our application to send an email. We're using the node mailer package. For this reason, you could just go ahead and npm install node mailer. I've already done that, so I'm not going to do it again. And you actually want an SMTP account for sending that email. And here's a link of all the SMTP services that works with node mailer. You can check them out. I am using Sendgrid And let me just open that up to show you how you would set Sendgrid up. So you come here, you create an account. I'm just gonna quickly log in to my account and come back and tell you how you would go about doing this. Okay, I wasn't able to log into my Sendgrid account because my two-factor authentication failed. For some reason, my cell phone isn't working today to get the text service, but regardless, you will create an account in Sendgrid. It wants you to verify an email so that you can send emails from that email. And then on your dashboard, you would see an option on the left-hand corner for working with the email APIs. And there is an option there that says integrating with email APIs or integrating with SMTP API. I'm going to include this link which tells you the steps you need to follow to actually set up your Sendgrid account. But as I said in the dashboard, once you click on integrating with the email API, it shows you two options. And one is the SMTP provider or the SMTP API. That's the one you want to click on. Once you click on it, it just tells you to create an API. And it gives you all the information you need to bring back into your application. What are the informations that you need to bring back? These are the information that you need. There is going to be a host or your server, which is in this case smtp.sendgrid.net. It is different if you're using a different service. Just bring in the domain or the address for your host. Then you're going to use a port. You have to get the port. This is again in that page. It tells you the ports that it supports. I'm using 587. That works well for this purpose. And there's going to be a username and a password. Your username in the case of the Sendgrid is this literal text of API key, and your password is going to be the actual API key that you generate. So on that page, when you go ahead to create an integration with the SMTP API, there's a button you click to get an API key. Your API key would be your password, and username is going to be API key. You also have to include this email from option, which is the email that you have actually verified to send an email on behalf of or through that email address, if it makes sense. Now, once you set up these are the information you get from your SMTP service provider. You bring it into your local environment file. So .m.local, you set it over here. And once you did that, you can now set up the email provider. So you go to your providers. You first get the email provider from the package. So I'm going to just right below my Google provider, I'm going to get the email provider. And in my provider, this is how I'm going to set the email provider. Okay. So what are the stuff? Again, we're calling this as a function. We're passing in our options. There's a server property and a from property. The server has host, port, and auth. And these are the information that we already set in our environment variables. The server, the host, the port, the username, the password, and the email from. So it's everything that we've already set in our environment variable. We're just bringing them as a connection object. Now in the notes, you can see, let me just close this off. In my notes, you could see that when you wanted to define this connection to your SMTP service, there's two ways you can do it. You can either do it using a connection string, which is literally bringing all of those options together in a string, just like how you would connect to your databases typically via a connection string or URI. Or you can bring them in individually and then put them as an object like the way that I did. Doesn't matter which way you do, it's just a matter of your preference. Okay, so we've got the email provider, we've called this function, we passed our database connection, and now if we go to sign in, as you can see, I can see the email provider right here. It is automatically rendered in my sign in page. Now let me just go ahead and see if this works. If I try to log into my email. Okay, check your email. This is another built-in page that comes in. This is the verify request page once you're using the email provider. Let me just quickly log into my email and see if I've got that email. So I'm gonna, okay, as you can see, I got the email sent to me. It says sign into localhost 3000. I click the sign in. It takes me to the application and I'm once again signed in, and it kind of connected me with this email to that same account that I had signing in with the Google sign in. And that's the benefit of using an email provider in conjunction with your OAuth services. In the event that the user, for whatever reason, loses access to their, let's say, Facebook account or Google account or LinkedIn account, they can still use that same email they had set up with their Facebook account to log into your system. So it's good to provide email provider together with the OAuth. So if people are locked out of their Facebook or social media accounts, they can still use that same email that they had to log into your system. Okay, so that was setting up the email provider. Let's now talk about using credential provider. Now, as I said, credentials provider is for when you already have an authentication system in place, a two-factor authentication, email password, user password, a database, and you want to integrate that into your system. It's the same concept. The only difference is that you would have to define an authorized function for credentials provider, and this is where you would write the logic of actually authenticating the user, connecting to a third-party service, connecting to your database, and then verifying the username, verifying the password, verifying the two-factor authentication code, and then logging them in or not. And the way that you log them in from this authorized function is that if you return an object from the authorized function, typically, or you would want to return a user object, it would be considered that they have passed the verification, and that user object that you return is going to be encoded in the token that you send to the client. If you return null from this authorized function, they won't be authenticated. It means that something went wrong. They will be redirected back to the sign-in page to retry. And alternatively, you can also throw an error from the authorized function, which instead of taking them back to the sign-in page, just redirects them back to the error page and still shows them an error as a query string in the URL. So let's just see how this works. I'm going to bring in the credentials provider from the package. So let me just import that up there. And I'm going to bring in the details of my credentials provider, as you can see also in the notes. And I'm going to explain what each of these things are. Before we talk about, well, this is a credentials provider. As a function, we're calling it, passing it options. Now, before I go ahead, before I talk about name and credentials, let's just talk about this authorized function that I just mentioned. This is the function where you would write your logic to authenticate the user. In this case, I'm getting the credentials that's submitted to my backend via post request. For example, here I have email and password. So I'm expecting my client-side application to send a post request with email and password. They will be passed into this authorized function. I'm destructuring them from the credentials, and I'm using this login user function, which I will bring in from my utility directory. I'm going to show you what this is. So it's a function that I have written to work with my specific system. So in the utilities, there's a MongoDB, and you can see this login user. It takes an email and password. It connects to the user's collection, check to see if I can find the user with that email. And if it finds the user, it compares the passwords. It's a hashed version of the passwords, compares to see if they're the same. And if they are, it returns the user object. Otherwise, it returns an error. So I'm bringing in that login function. So I can see if I have a user. If an error happens, I'm going to return null. And if not, I'm returning the user, meaning that the user is authenticated, and I'm encoding this user object in the token. Okay. Now, there's one catch with using credentials provider, and that is the credential provider does not work with database sessions. Let me backtrack. What is a database session? Generally speaking, we have two kind of major ways of dealing with authentication. The traditional way of authentication was a session-based authentication, whereby you would have a database, and upon authenticating a user, you would create a new record in your session table, in your session collection, if you're using a non-relational database, and you would provide the session ID back to the browser to include in subsequent requests so that they don't have to authenticate every time. Now, the alternative way to the session-based authentication is a token-based authentication, whereby there is no database for you to kind of create a session and keep the users logged in. Instead, when the users send their credentials, you would just encode the user information in a token, you hash it, you sign it, and then provide that to the browser so that that token is included in the subsequent requests. And there is no database lookup involved in that authentication. Now, the credentials provider here in the NextAuth package only works with the token-based strategy, not when you're having a database. Now, why does this matter? Well, when we are including an adapter to NextAuth, we're going to talk about the session strategy here and how you can explicitly define what it is, or what which of these two strategies, the session-based or a token-based, should be used. But once you include an adapter for the NextAuth package, it defaults to using a session, a database strategy. And credentials provider doesn't work with that. For that, we have to change the session strategy. Let me show you the session option that you can pass into NextAuth and how you can explicitly set it to use a token-based strategy so that you can continue using the credentials provider. So let me just come down to session. This is another option you can provide over here. So I'm going to say session. And session, as you can see here, is an object. And this is the default session object or session option, not the session object on the client side, but the option that you would set pass to your NextAuth package. Now, the strategy can be either a database, as I explained. This is session-based authentication that uses a database, and it can be JWT, which stands for JSON Web Tokens, which refers to the token-based strategy. Now, it defaults, as you can see here, to the JWT. However, if you specify an adapter, it would default to database. It no longer defaults to JWT. But you can explicitly set it to JWT if you want to by just passing that option. So let me just pass that option because I want to use a token-based strategy so I can use the credentials. So had I not had any adapters, this would have been redundant because it already defaults to token-based strategy or JWT. But because I've set up an adapter, the package defaults to using, because we have an adapter is to connect to a database. It thinks you want to use a database strategy or a session-based authentication, so it defaults to the database, which does not work with the credentials provider. So we need to explicitly set it back to token or JWT so we can continue to use the credentials provider. I hope this is not very confusing for you. So when I go back to sign in right now, you can see that in my sign in page, this sign in with credentials is automatically created, and I'm having these two inputs, email and password, already created for me. Now you might think, where did this email and password come in? I'm glad you asked. This is where we defined, or the options I skipped earlier. So the name is the name that it is used here. So sign in with credentials. If you want to say sign in with your email and password, you could just change that. And that name is used as an identification for this provider. And then the credentials is this input element on your form. So I have an email with an email label with a type of text placeholder, and these are HTML attributes that it would be set directly on this input element. And I have a password with a label of password with a placeholder and with a type of password, so when you type, I don't see the password, right? So as you can see here, you can define what your form should include. Now I have created a test user before. Let me see if I can log in with that test user. Yeah, you could see here now I'm logged in, and now it no longer shows that previous session that it was showing. It shows the test at test.com, which is this user that I created. Now let me quickly show you how this looks in my database. So this is MongoDB Compass. It's the best way to connect to your MongoDB databases and collections and work with your data there. I have an authentication auth database, and inside of it you see these different collections. These correspond to tables in SQL databases, and I have a user over here, and as you can see I have both users, a test user with an email and password, which is a hashed version of their password. This is how you need to do it, and the other user, which was from the Google sign-in. You can see here there is a verification tokens collection. This is where that verification token for email provider would be temporarily stored until the user clicks on the link to sign in, and it will be deleted after they have actually verified and created that account for themselves. So let me just close this off. Just wanted to show you how it will look like in your database. Now, the next step for us is, let me just go back to credentials provider. We talked about the different options, the name, credentials, and the authorized function. Okay, so next configuration option you can pass into NextAuth is a secret. The secret is a string that's used to hash your tokens and cookies. You have to provide a secret, or alternatively, which is the recommended way as well, is to set in a NextAuth secret environment variable. So in your environment variables, you would set a NextAuth secret. This is a random string that it is used to hash your tokens and cookies and create cryptographic keys. It is recommended to use this environment variable instead of passing in a secret option to this object, because in the future versions they might deprecate this secret option in favor of setting an environment variable. So set the environment variable. Next is session. We have already touched on the session. We talked about what it defaults to. There are two more options over here, max age and update age. As you can see here, the max age is how long until an idle session will expire and is no longer valid. So you could define the maximum age of your sessions over here. It defaults to 30 days, and there's going to be an update age, and this is how frequently you would update your database to extend your session. If you set it to 0, it will always update the session with the database. And obviously if you're using the token strategy, this option will be ignored, because in the token strategy there is no database for you to kind of extend your sessions on. The pages option is where you would define your custom pages. So as I mentioned before, a NextAuth package comes with auto-generated built-in sign-in, sign-out, verification request pages for you. But if you want to use your own pages, you create them, and you would pass the URL of those pages to this as this option over here. So you go pages, sign in. That's the path where my sign-in page lives. That's the path where my sign-out page lives. And there are 5 different pages you need to provide. And if you don't want to provide one, just leave it out. Or if you just want to customize the sign-in page, just provide that. For the rest, the NextAuth package, when necessary, is going to use the built-in page. Now, when you want to set these pages up, they're pretty straightforward. I also have a link in the note here you can follow, but I would recommend looking at the source code of how NextAuth package actually created these pages, so that you can replicate the logic that they have there from the things you need to do, the environment variables you need to set, the parameters you need to read from the query string, to get an idea of what are the stuff happening behind the scenes, so you can duplicate that logic and add it to your custom page. Next option you can pass into NextAuth is callbacks. Callbacks are asynchronous functions that are executed upon actions that are performed in your application, such as when a user signs in, when a user is redirected to a page, when a session is created or updated, where a token is created or updated. These callbacks are called, and it gives you some ability to customize what's happening. For example, if you want to provide more information to your browser in your session object. So right now you can see my session object has a user and expires. If I want to provide more information or expose more information to the browser, I can use these callbacks to pass that information to the browser. The way that I would do it, for example, if I want to pass in an access token to the browser, in the JOT or JWT callback, I'll get the account that's coming from my, let's say, Google account or OAuth account. I will get the access token from it the first time that the user logs in, and I will set that on the token and return this token. This is the same token that will be hashed and sent to the browser. Now, if you want to provide information to the session object on the browser, you have to actually add it to the session. This is the session object that's provided to the browser. So I will get the access token from this token that I just added in the prior step, and then set it on my session and then return the session. Now on the session, on my client side in the browser, I would get this access token added to this object. So the callbacks give you some flexibility into customizing the behavior of the token creation, the session object, and the information that's exposed to the browser. I've also included a link to the callbacks documentation if you needed to dig any further. Adapter is an option we've already talked about, but we're going to go over it one more time. It's the way that you would connect or pass a connection to your database to the NextAuth package to use. Again, there's a list of adapters on the documentation of NextAuth, or you can create your own adapter if you're using a database that's not listed there. And all you need to do is install that adapter from NextAuth package or create your own and pass it a connected client to your database so that NextAuth can use that database to create the collection that it needs, the users, the accounts, and reads and writes it needs to do to the database. The only thing that I'll remind you here is that when you set an adapter, the session strategy automatically defaults to database. If you still need to use a token-based strategy, for example, to enable you to use the credentials provided, you have to explicitly set the strategy to JWT, otherwise it defaults to database and your credential provider wouldn't work. Last but not least is theme. The theme allows you to customize these built-in pages. So for example, if I go to the sign-in page, let me just bring in the theme and show you what stuff you can change on it. So there's a color scheme. You can set it to auto, dark, or light, which is a dark theme, light theme, or auto reads from the system preferences. There is a brand color you can set. These are the accent colors. I'm going to change and you will see what it changed on our forums, and a logo, a URL to your logo. So let me bring in something that I have set before, very basic over here. So if I go back to my sign-in page now, refresh, you would see that right now it will be light because I've set the color scheme to light. I have included red as my brand color. As you can see, these labels are now red. And I've included the Vercel logo URL, which is in my public folder over here as a logo. A little customization with the built-in pages if you want to use them. And you're more than welcome to create your own and link to them in your NextAuth config. Last step for setup, for initializing this package, is setting up environment variables for NextAuth package. Specifically, we talked about the NextAuth secret. That's the random string that's used to hash your cookies. The other thing that you need to set for production environment is a NextAuth URL. This is the canonical URL of your site. So example.com right now for me is localhost. This is not for production. Whatever domain that you have, you would set it here. You would also set it in your production environment. If you're deploying to Vercel, for example, you can easily set environment variables on Vercel. This is another step that you would need for NextAuth to work properly. Great. So we've set up NextAuth. We've included the providers that we want. We've decided about the strategy we want to use, persist the user data, the verification tokens. Now we want to know, how do we actually work with this session object, with this session data on the client side in our React or Next.js application? Well, here comes the client API and gives you access to components and hooks you can use to kind of work with the session object. Now, the session object looks something like this. It's familiar because we have already seen this. It has a user object with name, email, and image, and an expiry date. As you can see, the user object contains enough data for display purposes, but as we discussed before, through the callbacks that you could pass in here, the JWT and the session, you can provide more information to this session object if you want to pass or expose extra data to your browser side. Now, to work with this session state or session object, we need to wrap our application in a context provider. So NextAuth comes with a component called session provider, which is a React context provider that shares this session state. So we have to go to our _app.js and wrap it with this session provider component that we got from this package. So let's actually do that. Go to pages, _app. I've already done this here. So I got the session provider from the package, and I just wrapped this component, the session provider, which just allows anything inside this component to access the session state. So the session provider is nothing but a React context provider. Now you can optionally pass in a session prop to the session provider component to prevent this component from fetching the session twice if you have already fetched the session at the page level. So for pages that are using server-side rendering, you can, and we'll discuss how, you can fetch the session to see if the user is authenticated or not. And if you provide that session as a prop to the page, the session as a prop to the page, it will be accessible here, page props.session. So if you already fetched the session there, you don't want to do it again, you pass it as a session prop to the session provider, which then takes that session and shares that as the context. Okay? But that's optional, it's just for performance reasons. There are other props that you can pass to session provider. The session I already told you, but there's base path, refetch interval, and refetch on window focus. I'm happy with the defaults. You could read more about what they are here on my note. If you needed to change them, nevertheless, it's just a component that shares the session state. Now that we have shared or exposed this session context, the easiest way for us to hook into this context is using a custom hook called useSession. This is the easiest way at a component level or on any page to check the session. How would you do this? You will call the useSession. It will give you the data back, which is your session or a status. Data is either undefined, this data that you get back from calling, which we rename to session from this custom hook that we got from the library. It can either be undefined, this is when we haven't yet fetched the session. It can be null when we fail to fetch any session or there is no session, or it can be the session object. The status is either loading, so when we're fetching the session, it's either or authenticated when there is a session object, or unauthenticated when the user is not logged in. As you can see over here, when I go back to my home page, the status shows authenticated and I have a session object. If I sign out, I'm going to talk about this sign out in a second, but you can see I'm unauthenticated, that's the status, and there is no session. Okay. And this is exactly what I've done in this index or my home page that I told you I'm going to explain when we get here. So I'm using this useSession hook. I'm getting the data and the status back. I'm renaming data as session. I'm checking to see if the status is loading. I'm showing a loading spinner. Otherwise, I'm showing my home page, which is this guy. And there's some links and buttons over here. And down here, you can see I'm checking to see if there's a session. And if there is, I'm just showing the session object. And if not, I'm just saying there is no active session. So this is the easiest way you can protect your pages behind authentication. In any page that needs to be protected for logged in users, you can just call the use session hook on that page, on that component, and check to see if there is a session. Easy peasy. Or you can take this even further. Now the use session hook gives you an option to pass a required true option to it. And when you're passing required true to this hook, it makes sure that there is a session. And if after the loading there is no session, it will automatically redirect the user to the sign-in page. From where, once they complete the sign-in, they will be redirected back to the page that they initially requested. So as you can see here, if I pass in required true, it will make sure that there's a session. It will make sure that the user is logged in. Otherwise, it will redirect the user back to the sign-in page. Now, when you set the required true, as you can see here in this notes, it says the status, which could be loading unauthenticated and authenticated, generally speaking, when you set the required to true, the status is either loading or authenticated. Because if they are unauthenticated, they won't be on this page. They would be redirected back to the sign-in page. So in the case that you have set the required true, this is what I'm explaining here. The status can only be loading or authenticated. So I'm just checking to see if I'm loading. I say loading. Otherwise, the user is signed in. So instead of you calling this hook and checking to see if there is any session, you can just pass required true here. So one less step if you want to protect your page behind authentication on the client side. So this is client side authentication. This has to load, the context is shared, the session is fetched, the hook hooks into the context, checks to see if there's a session or not. Client side authentication. Now, furthermore, we're going to talk about how you would do server-side authentication, but for now, this is how you would do it client-side in your NextJS application. Now, you can take this a bit further by making it easier to protect any page on your application, and I'm going to explain it here. You can also read through the notes. It's just using an extra component to make protecting your pages easier. And the way that it is implemented is, instead of calling the use session hook on every page that we want to protect, what if we create an auth component, call this hook there, and set the required to true, and then in our underscore app.js, this is our custom app function, we check to see if our page component, this is the page component function, if it has set a property, this is optional, or this is, you can decide what name you want to put this, and I'll show you how to set this. We'll check to see if our page requires authentication. We will wrap it inside of our auth. Otherwise, we just return our component. And all this auth does, as you can see down here, is just a custom component that I'm calling the use session inside of, which makes sure with the required true option that there is a session, meaning that the user is logged in. And if the user is not logged in, they will be redirected back to the sign-in page. So by wrapping this component in there, I'm making sure they're logged in. I'm checking to see for loading status. Again, when required is true, you are either loading or you're authenticated, in which case I just return the children, and the children is just this component, as if I was just returning this. So if you're authenticated and the page required auth, I'm just returning that same component. Otherwise, I'm redirecting the user back to the sign-in page. Now, how do you set this auth component on the page component? Well, this is an example of a page, whatever you have over here. Before you export your page, you pass the auth, you set the auth property to true. And this is the same property you're checking in your underscore app or custom app function. So I set it here, I check it there. With this technique, instead of calling use session hook in every page you need to be protected against behind authentication, you would just set auth to true on any page that requires authentication. You set this auth function once in your underscore app.js, and all it does, it just hooks into this use session and requires a session. And on any page that you're creating in the future, if it requires authentication, you just set the auth to true. If all of your site requires authentication, you can just, for all of them, return this first half of this check. So you won't check because everything requires authentication, and you literally wrap all of the page components inside of this auth, which requires authentication. Easy peasy. Get session. So this is a function that allows you to check the session on the server side. So it's a function that you can actually call on the client side and the server side. It calls the same session endpoint to fetch the session. It returns a promise that resolves to the session object if there is any, or null if there isn't. So I'm calling this from the client side, as you can see, inside of a function. I'm calling get session. I'm evading the promise. I'm getting the session back. Server side example, I'm calling the get session function inside of my request handlers. This is your API handlers. And I'm evading the promise. I'm getting the session back. The only difference is when you're calling get session on the server side, you need to pass the request object to it. In both cases, it returns a promise that resolves to your session. So on my API, I can check to see if the user is logged in by checking the session. If they are, I respond. Otherwise, I maybe reject their API request. And as easy as that, you can protect your API routes or any code on the server side with authentication with the use of this get session function. Last two functions. How do you sign the users in? How do you sign them out on the client side? Now, if you're using the built-in pages, you won't necessarily need to use this sign-in function. I'm going to talk about how you would use it and different ways you can call this function. But if you're using these built-in pages, this sign-in functionality is already hooked up to these buttons over here. But we will talk about it nevertheless. We would more so use the sign out because we would need to sign users out in some way or the other. So now using the sign-in method makes sure that the user is redirected back to the same page that they started the sign-in flow. So if the user was on the home page, they clicked on the sign in to sign in, they will be redirected back to the home page. If they start from the about page and they sign in, they will be redirected back to the about page. It's the same way for sign out. They will be automatically redirected back to the page that they started the flow. And the second benefit is that it would automatically handle CSRF tokens for you, because from this form, there's going to be a form here, and from this form, you're posting a request to your site, and to mitigate the CSRF attack, it automatically handles CSRF tokens or generates CSRF tokens and checks it for you. Now, a CSRF attack is when somebody forges a request from a different site pretending to be coming from your site. I actually have a post about CSRF attacks on my site. You can check it out if you know, but for the concerns of this video, we just know if you're using the sign-in method, the NextAuth package automatically is creating CSRF tokens and mitigating that risk in our forms. So as you can see here, I have a button that on click that calls sign in. So sign in method can be called in two ways. You can either call the function without passing any argument to it. And if you do so, it would just take the user to the sign in page. So what happens here, if you can see on my home page, I have a link over here that, I have a button over here, sign in button. Let me just start from the link because I mentioned it. So this link, this first button, the green button that you can see here, is just the link. It's just a link that's pointing to API auth sign in. So it goes to that endpoint, a GET request to that endpoint is get handled by the NextAuth package, which just renders our sign-in page. Easy peasy. Second way we can go to that same sign-in page is by calling the sign-in function and not passing any arguments to it. So this is the second button. This sign-in button on click just calls the sign-in, doesn't pass anything to it. We're just redirected or brought to that same sign-in page. But there is one difference there. As I mentioned, it makes sure that the user is redirected back to the page that they started from. And how it does that is it sets this callback URL up in the query string. You see, when I click on this link, which is just a link, has nothing to do with the signing function, it takes me to API auth sign-in, but does not set any callback URL, because it's just us going to this endpoint, and this endpoint sends a GET request to that endpoint. NextAuth has already generated API handlers for us that just responds with the sign-in page. But if I click on this button, which is hooked up to this sign-in function, it will take me to the API sign-in page, but additionally, it will set this callback URL. So it makes sure after the user actually completes the sign-in with whatever provider and method that they like, that they're redirected back to the same page. Now, the second way you can call the sign-in function is to pass the provider's ID. What does it mean? Well, I'm calling sign-in here and passing the provider ID, in this case, Google. In this case, instead of redirecting the user to the sign-in page, it starts the Google sign-in flow. So, or whatever provider that you're setting here. If I'm calling sign-in with Facebook, it just starts the Facebook login flow. Now, obviously, if you're calling it with your email provider, so you will pass email here, or your credentials provider, like here, I'm passing in my email ID or email provider. As the second argument to this function, I'll pass an object where I actually pass in the email that this sign-in flow requires. Because an email provider needs an email. This is then sent to the authorized endpoint to send that email, that link, that verification request. And if I'm calling sign in with credentials, for example, again, as the second argument that I pass in to sign in, I actually pass the credentials that my endpoint is expecting. In my case was email and password. Well, I'm missing email over here, but you get the idea. You would pass in your credentials. In this function, we'll call your authorized endpoint, that same authorized function that we created when we were defining the credentials provider, and it will pass these credentials to that endpoint to then verify the user. Now, again, if you're using this built-in sign-in page, all of this functionality is already hooked. So this sign-in with credentials already reads these two values and sends them for you to your backend. This is more so if you want to implement your own custom sign-in pages or pages that you would need to know how this sign-in method works. And again, I recommend you look at the source code and see how NextAuth is doing it in the built-in page that they have, so that you could replicate the logic. It's pretty straightforward, and in almost all of the applications that I have built that uses NextAuth for authentication, I've customized my pages because I don't want to use this generic page. So I've customized it, and it's pretty easy. And if you need help in doing that, let me know in the comments below and I can help you out. I am also recording a video that I created, a Twitter clone, and in that we're building a full stack application like Twitter from the back end to the front end. And in the authentication, I'm using NextAuth. So if you want, follow along with that video and you would see actually me creating custom pages in that video. Nevertheless, there's another option you can pass in here to the sign-in function, and that's a callback URL or a redirect false option. So the callback URL is to which URL the user will be redirected after they completed the sign-in. So for example, here I'm signing in with an email and I'm saying, hey, after they completed the sign-in, forward them to /foo. If you don't provide any callback, it would just default to the current URL. But if you want to redirect the user to a specific page, you can set it up here. You can also pass in a redirect false option to disable this automatic redirection after the completion. So if you set redirect to false, the user would stay on the sign-in page even after completing the sign-in flow. And obviously this redirect false only works for your email provider and credentials provider. Because remember, for OAuth, you've already set the redirect URL in your service, in the Google Cloud Services, in your Facebook. So they will be redirected to a different page anyways. For your email and for your credentials, if you prefer the user to stay on the same page, for example, to show them an error, or redirect them yourself, you can set the redirect to false. And when you set the redirect to false, the sign-in method returns a promise, which resolves to an object that looks like this. There's an error property on it you can check. There's a status and OK property you can check to see if verification, if the authentication was passed, verified or not. And there is a URL here, which is the validated or the verified URL that the user would have been redirected to otherwise had you not set this redirect false option, which you can use to actually manually redirect the users using, let's say, client-side transition, next router, to redirect them yourself instead of having the NextAuth package redirecting the user. Now you can also pass in additional parameters. Some of the OAuth providers need additional parameters. You can pass them as the third argument you pass into the sign-in method. Sign out, that's how you would sign users out. Again, it makes sure the user is redirected back to the page that they started. This sign out flow, it handles the CSRF tokens automatically because, again, you're submitting a post request from a form. And the third thing is that when it is redirecting the user back to the page they started the sign out flow, it also refreshes the page in the browser, so reloads the page in the browser. These are the three things that happens when you're calling the sign out function. How do we call it? Well, you can see here on a button, on click, I'm calling sign out. And in my homepage is, you can see here, I have two links again. One of them, the first one, is just the link that goes to API auth sign out. This link takes you to this sign out page if you have any custom one or this built-in one from NextAuth that just asks the user if they want to actually sign out. And this button actually calls the sign out function. So my first button here didn't call the sign out function. It was just a link that went to that endpoint, which then just returned the sign out page. And this button that I have here, sign out button, as you can see, is hooked to this sign out function. It calls the sign out. So when I call this directly, it just signs the user out directly. It doesn't show any sign out page. This guy shows the sign out page first, and then you can click to sign out. So again, you can pass some options to your sign out. For example, you can specify a callback URL. Well, if you don't want to specify a callback URL, it defaults to the current URL. That's how it makes sure that the user goes back to the URL that started the sign out flow. If you want to send them to a different URL, you can pass it as a callback URL. The second option you can provide, again, similar to sign in, is redirect false. And that, again, disables the automatic redirection that comes in with sign in and sign out. And you may want to do that again for, let's say you're using the credentials provider and you want the users to stay on the same page. So if there's any errors, you can show them the error. So you set the redirect false. There's another benefit with setting the redirect false, and that is it does not reload the page. So maybe once the user signs out, you don't want them to lose your React state by reloading the page in the browser, or you don't like the flicker that happens when browsers refresh a page or reload a page. In that case, you would set the redirect false. It would, again, just like sign in function, returns a promise that will resolve to this object. This object has one property, and that's the URL. This is the verified URL the user would have been redirected to. Otherwise, had you not set this redirect to false. You could use this URL with a client-side transition like the next router and redirect the user to wherever you want so that the page is not reloaded, you're not losing any state, the user is not seeing any flicker, and they're transitioned into the page that they want. And if any error happens when they're signing in or they're signing out, you could still be on that same page, show them an error message instead of just the redirection and the reloading happening. So that's it for me, folks. I think we covered a lot from how the package works, how to initialize it, different providers that you could use with it, different options you can pass with it, different strategies from session-based authentication to token-based authentication, how you would actually work with the authentication on the client side using the client APIs. And I really hope you have learned something in this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye-bye.